What if the man sitting quietly in first class, the one you thought didn't belong, owned the very airline you were flying? This isn't just a story about a flight gone wrong. It's about power, silence, and what happens when dignity takes the pilot's seat. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The morning air inside Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was crisp, humming with the quiet bustle of early travelers. Floor-to-ceiling windows filtered soft sunlight into the Skybridge lounge, casting warm patterns on the polished tile floors. People lounged in leather chairs, sipped coffee from porcelain cups, their conversations hushed and full of half-finished stories. It was, by all accounts, a typical morning for first-class passengers. That was until Augustus and Delilah Moreau walked in. Augustus stood tall, shoulders relaxed beneath a well-fitted blazer in slate gray. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and his eyes, dark, steady, scanned the room with a kind of quiet awareness. Nothing about him demanded attention, but something about him refused to be overlooked. Delilah at his side moved with unhurried grace. She carried a worn paperback in one hand and gently rested her other hand in the crook of her husband's elbow. Her cardigan hung loosely over a soft floral dress, and her presence was soothing, like the whisper of a favorite hymn. They didn't speak much as they entered. Just a nod to the receptionist, a kind thank you, and they settled near the window. Delilah opened her book while Augustus reached for a newspaper, but his fingers paused. Something in the air, subtle but familiar, had shifted. From across the lounge, a man in a navy suit leaned toward his companion and muttered just loud enough, "You sure they belong in this lounge?" It wasn't shouted, not even spoken directly to them, but it didn't need to be. That tone, coated in entitlement, seasoned with judgment, had a way of hanging in the air longer than most words should. Augustus didn't respond. He didn't even look over. Instead, he slowly adjusted the strap on his leather carry-on, eyes fixed on the business section of his paper. But his fingers gripped the handle just a little tighter. Delilah didn't look up from her book. Her voice was soft. "You okay?" He nodded once, then let out a quiet breath, like someone learning not to flinch anymore. A few minutes passed before the double doors to the lounge opened again, this time revealing a woman in a pristine Navy uniform. Cambria Sloan walked with purpose, clipboard in hand, heels tapping confidently on the marble floor. She was in her late 40s, with tightly pinned blonde hair and a sharp jawline. Her expression, though practiced, carried the faintest hint of superiority, like someone who'd seen too much and learned too little. Cambria began scanning the lounge, checking off names. Her eyes moved swiftly across the room until they landed on the Moreaus. Her steps slowed, just slightly, just enough. She approached with a thin smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning," she said, more out of obligation than warmth. "Can I see your boarding passes, please?" Delilah smiled gently and reached into her purse. "Of course." Cambria took the tickets and looked them over, her lips tightening. Then she looked at them again, longer this time. Her tone shifted only a shade, but it was enough to cut. "Are you both sure you're in the right lounge? First class, you know." Augustus looked up then, not startled, not offended, just quiet. His gaze met hers, and for a moment, the room felt smaller. Delilah didn't answer. She simply handed over the boarding passes with a grace that made the question feel foolish. Cambria studied them for another beat, then nodded quickly. "Enjoy your flight," she muttered, handing them back. As she walked away, Delilah closed her book and whispered, "You promised we wouldn't make waves this trip." Augustus didn't look away from where Cambria had gone. His voice was calm, steady. "I promised not to make waves, unless someone else starts a storm." Outside, the clouds above the runway began to shift. Planes roared in the distance. But inside that lounge, the silence was louder. Something had been stirred, just enough to wake it. And somewhere behind Augustus's still eyes, the storm was already taking shape. The hum of the aircraft was steady, almost soothing, as Augustus settled into his seat. The leather cushion gave slightly under his weight, but he sat upright, polished, composed. He held a travel magazine in his hands, eyes scanning the page but not reading a word. His mind had gone somewhere else, somewhere much earlier. He was 17 again, nervous, too proud to show it. He had walked into a small regional airport with a crisp shirt, a folded piece of scholarship paperwork in his pocket, and enough cash for his very first plane ticket. He had rehearsed what to say, had practiced handing over the envelope with a steady voice, but it never got that far. A guard had spotted him walking toward the counter and stepped directly in front of him. Just stood there, like a wall. "Not here, kid," the man had said. Not unkind but firm. "This ain't your kind of place." Augustus had frozen, heart racing, throat dry. He remembered the weight of shame more than the words, remembered turning around before anyone else could hear. That walk back to the bus stop had felt longer than the entire trip home. Now, decades later, he sat in first class with his name printed on corporate stock agreements. And yet those same glances, the ones questioning whether he belonged, had followed him right through the glass doors of the Skybridge Lounge. He folded the magazine and set it aside. Delilah noticed the shift in his body language. She didn't need words to read him. Her hand reached over and settled on his. Calm, anchoring. "You always get quiet before you move mountains," she said, her voice low but sure. Augustus smiled faintly. Not because it was funny, because it was true. Delilah had seen him in boardrooms where entire companies tried to out-talk him, where executives measured every inch of him, trying to find fault. And yet it was always his silence that unsettled them. Because when Augustus went quiet, he was thinking, preparing. He squeezed her fingers gently and looked out the window. "I didn't come here to shake anything up," he said, barely louder than a breath. Delilah turned her head slightly, watching the side of his face. "Power isn't about proving people wrong, Gus. It's about making things right." He nodded but didn't respond. Instead, his thumb brushed the edge of his wedding ring, a small, quiet motion that steadied him like it always did. The moment was broken by a young flight attendant approaching. He was in his 20s, neat uniform, polite smile. "Reed," his name tag said. "Mr. Moreau," Reed whispered as he leaned in, speaking discreetly. "Boardroom sends regards. Everything is in place for post-flight transition." Augustus gave a subtle nod, not looking up. Just enough acknowledgement to say he heard. Reed smiled and walked off as if he'd only been confirming a drink order. Delilah, still sipping her tea, didn't even glance up. But the corners of her mouth lifted ever so slightly. It was clear now. Augustus wasn't just a man in seat 2A. He was something more. And the plane was flying towards something bigger than San Francisco. A few rows up, Cambria Sloan was making her way down the aisle with a tray of hot towels. Her posture was perfect, practiced. But as she neared Augustus and Delilah, her steps became slightly more deliberate. When she reached their row, she glanced at them, hesitated, then moved on, completely skipping their seats. No eye contact, no offer, just a silent dismissal, as if they didn't exist. The man seated behind Augustus tilted his head, watching the interaction. His brow furrowed just slightly, a sign that someone else had noticed. The silence around the action was louder than the tray itself. Augustus didn't react. He kept his hands folded in his lap, but Delilah reached over and rested her hand on his. No words, just presence. He exhaled slowly. The world might not change overnight, but moments like these, they etched themselves in memory. And sometimes memory was where the storm began. "I gave them my silence today," he murmured, turning toward Delilah with a quiet weight in his voice. "Let's see if they deserve it tomorrow." As the cabin lights dimmed slightly and flight attendants prepared for descent, the camera in the mind's eye would have panned out, across a handful of passengers now watching a little more closely, past the seatback screens and tray tables, and down to the small embossed leather planner in Augustus's bag, now barely visible beneath the seat. On the first page, tucked neatly behind a business card, read one line: Augustus Moreau, Executive Transition Authority, Sky Nova Airlines. The plane leveled off somewhere above the clouds and the stillness of cruising altitude settled into the cabin. First class had its usual hush, soft clinks of glassware, the gentle shuffle of pillows, pages turning, napkins being unfolded. But beneath that surface calm, something felt off. Augustus noticed it in the way the air moved, not quite tense, but different. A tightness, subtle but growing. He wasn't the only one sensing it. Eyes followed Cambria Sloane as she moved about with her tray and trained politeness, though the cracks in her demeanor were starting to show. She smiled too brightly at a pair of men in suits, laughed at a joke that wasn't funny, but when she passed by the Miros, her expression cooled like a gust through a cracked window. Her posture shifted. Not enough to be called out, but enough to be noticed. A woman in her 70s, seated next to Delilah, leaned over. Her southern drawl was light but clear. "I don't like how she looked at you. It wasn't right." Delilah offered a polite smile, setting her book down with care. "That's kind of you to say, ma'am. We're used to funny looks." The older woman shook her head. "Doesn't mean you ought to be." That simple exchange, shared in a whisper, rippled quietly through the space between rows. Cambria glanced back for a split second, catching the woman's eyes before turning away sharply. Her mask had slipped, if only for a moment. Later, as the drink cart made its pass, Cambria arrived at the Moreau's row with a more mechanical air. She held the stem of a wine glass too loosely, and just as she leaned to offer a pour, the glass tipped, spilling directly onto Augustus's tray. A fine mist of sparkling water splashed his sleeve. "Oh, I guess some people just don't know how to sit still in first class," Cambria muttered. It wasn't loud, but it landed like a slap. The cabin went still. The man in the aisle seat ahead turned halfway, his brow furrowing. A few rows down, a young mother looked up from her tablet, eyes narrowing. The tension in the air was no longer subtle. Augustus didn't react immediately. He took a clean napkin from the holder, wiped his hand, and folded the cloth with slow precision. Then, eyes calm but unwavering, he turned to Cambria. "Perhaps professionalism is harder to maintain at 35,000 feet, he said. The words weren't raised, not a syllable sharper than necessary, but something about the way he said it made people sit up. For a breath or two, the cabin seemed to hold itself still, like waiting for someone to speak too loudly in a cathedral. Cambria offered no apology, just a thin smile and a quick retreat toward the galley. But the moment had broken open. A few seats behind them, a young woman stood up, gripping her carry-on. She was in her late 20s, Asian American, dressed in a navy sweater and jeans. "I need to move," she said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I don't feel comfortable staying here. Your flight attendant has been treating people differently, and it's not right." One of the secondary attendants, a young man with a tense face and an earpiece, approached immediately. "Yes, ma'am. Let me help you find another seat." The exchange was brief but carried weight. Other passengers were watching now, phones lowered, screens forgotten. What had started as glances had grown into concern, into awareness. In the cockpit, the co-pilot began a quiet exchange with ground operations. Code words, internal flags. They didn't need to say it out loud. Something was happening in first class, and it couldn't be brushed aside this time. Back in his seat, Augustus remained still, but Delilah noticed the way his jaw shifted ever so slightly. The silence in him was no longer the silence of retreat. It was something else. Moments later, Reed returned, his steps quiet, face unreadable. He slipped a folded piece of paper onto Augustus's armrest and moved on without a word. Augustus opened it slowly. "Lounge Director and Passenger Operations, requesting confidential meeting upon landing. You're not alone in this." He stared at the message, then let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. Not because the problem had been solved, far from it, but he wasn't standing alone at the edge anymore. Someone had noticed. Someone was listening. He folded the note and slipped it into his inside pocket. Delilah looked at him, brows gently raised. He gave her a half smile, worn, thoughtful. "Seems the quiet part's over." When Cambria reappeared in the aisle a few minutes later, the cabin had changed. She didn't move as confidently now. And as she passed through, she spotted two phones pointed discreetly in her direction. Passengers were filming, documenting. The shield of professional distance had cracked. Augustus turned to the window. The clouds were thinning outside. Somewhere far below, the ground waited. But he wasn't focused on that. "The storm, Delilah," he said softly. "It just started." Delilah didn't speak. She just reached over, warm fingers closing around his hand, steady and certain. The mood in the first-class cabin had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The easy silence that once wrapped the rows like a blanket was gone, replaced by a cautious stillness. It wasn't loud, but it was present, like the pressure in the air right before a thunderstorm breaks. After the young woman had moved seats, a few passengers had started showing subtle signs of solidarity. A nod here, a glance there. One man asked for his coffee with a pointed thank you directed at the Miros. It wasn't loud support, but it was enough to suggest a current of unease. Others, though, kept quiet, heads down, eyes on screens. There was always that fraction of people who preferred not to get involved, even when the truth was sitting 3 feet away, holding a cloth napkin in silence. Cambria Sloane was starting to fray. Her steps had lost their rhythm. She moved down the aisle with forced grace, offering drinks without looking people in the eye. Her smile was a little too tight. The veneer of poise that had carried her for decades was beginning to slip, and she knew it. In row 2, Augustus sat with his hands clasped in his lap, still, calm. But inside, the weight of the moment was bearing down. The silence had stretched long enough. He could feel the attention building, not just from the passengers, but from something larger, less visible. Responsibility. Delilah, seated beside him, slipped her hand into his and gave it a gentle squeeze. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice like warm tea, steady and familiar. He let out a slow breath. "I'm wondering if silence has done enough, or if it's time for the name on that ownership contract to speak louder." Delilah looked at him, long and soft. "You've spent decades building power," she said, "but your legacy won't be how you used it to punish. It'll be how you used it to lead." Augustus turned to her, and for a beat, the noise of the cabin faded. There was something in her eyes, an understanding that didn't need to be spoken. He nodded once, slowly. She had a way of bringing him back to himself when the weight got too heavy. Just then, Reed appeared beside them, his voice low. "Sir," he said, "after reviewing cabin recordings, operations confirms your authority to act. But they advise waiting until touchdown to execute formal action." Augustus tilted his head. The message was clear. He had every right to make the call now. Fire her. End it. In front of everyone. The evidence was there, and the moment was his. But that wasn't the man he was. Delilah touched his arm, barely more than a brush. "If you act now, she'll be humiliated," she said. "But if you wait, she'll be held accountable. And maybe more people will understand why." Augustus let her words settle. He looked around the cabin. Some passengers were watching openly now, others trying not to. But the room had shifted. What happened next would not go unseen. He exhaled through his nose and with a quiet motion, nodded. No grand declaration, just a choice, steady and firm. The captain's voice crackled overhead, announcing the beginning of their descent into San Francisco. Seat backs clicked into place, windows adjusted. The flight crew began their final checks, and the world tilted downward ever so slightly. Cambria passed through once more, gathering empty glasses with stiff fingers. As she neared Augustus and Delilah, her eyes flicked up and locked with his. For a moment, everything held still. She saw it then. Not anger, not resentment, just certainty. A quiet inevitability that wrapped around her throat more tightly than any outburst ever could. She moved on without a word. Augustus reached down and tugged at the cuff of his sleeve, straightening it. Then he checked his watch, tapping the face once. The minutes until landing ticked away, but the weight of what came after pressed in harder than the altitude. He looked out the window, where the clouds began to part, and the first lights of the Bay Area blinked into view beneath them. "Let her land first," he said quietly to himself. "Then we'll fly differently." Delilah turned toward him, her hand still on his arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her eyes told him everything. She knew this wasn't about revenge. It was about something bigger, something long overdue. She had known the moment wasn't yet, but it was close. As the aircraft began its slow descent, the cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow. Passengers instinctively checked their seatbelts, straightened their chairs, folded up their tray tables, but the usual calm of this final stretch was absent. The tension in the air now was thick enough to stir the surface of untouched drinks. Cambria moved through the cabin with a clipboard in hand, her polished routine now tainted by uncertainty. She scanned faces without stopping, but this time passengers didn't look away. They met her gaze. Some stared with quiet disapproval, Others simply watched with a knowing stillness that made the space feel heavier. Near the front of the cabin, a man in a Navy business suit stood up. He had a graying beard, carried himself like someone who had sat in more than a few boardrooms. His voice, though measured, cut clearly through the hush. "Is there a reason?" he asked, looking directly at Cambria. "This couple has been treated differently throughout the flight?" Cambria paused. She straightened, forced a tight smile. "Sir, we treat all passengers with equal respect." The man blinked once, his face steady. "I saw enough to disagree." With that, he sat back down. But the ripple had begun. A low murmur passed through the cabin. Cambria, no longer shielded by uniform or title, stood alone in a room that had started to shift its weight away from her. From his seat, Augustus didn't move. He just watched the coastline slowly unfold outside the window as the plane dipped lower into the late afternoon haze. The skyline of San Francisco, softened by distance and sun, rose gradually through the mist. His mind drifted back to the day he signed the Sky Nova deal. The ink had barely dried when he looked at the papers and quietly asked Delilah, "Will they know whose hands are behind this plane, or just whose face is in the seat?" He hadn't had an answer then, but now as the city came into view and the silence around him grew purposeful, something inside him settled. He knew. The wheels lowered with a low groan. The flaps adjusted. The plane was preparing to touch down. But the shift that mattered most wasn't in the altitude. It was happening inside the cabin, between people who'd walked on board thinking this was just another flight. A young man, probably in his early 30s, unbuckled quickly as the plane hit the tarmac and began taxiing. He turned and leaned slightly toward Augustus, holding a phone loosely in one hand. "Excuse me," he said. "I follow aviation stocks. Are you Augustus Miro, the new partner at Sky Nova?" A moment passed. Augustus looked up and smiled gently. "I am." The reaction was immediate and varied. One passenger gasped softly. Another lowered their head with a touch of embarrassment. Several began whispering, and at least one started typing rapidly on a smartphone. But none of it compared to the look on Cambria Sloane's face. She had turned halfway to glance back at the commotion, and when she heard his name confirmed, her complexion drained. Her mouth opened, but no words came. She stared at Augustus like she'd just realized she was on a different plane entirely. He didn't look at her. Not yet. As the plane rolled toward the gate, the silence grew again. Different this time. Now it was filled with anticipation, with people rethinking everything that had happened in the past few hours. Then the internet caught up. A tweet popped up and began spreading like wildfire. "Witness blatant racial bias on its Sky Nova Air First Class. Turns out the target was their new co-owner. Buckle up." A second post followed within minutes. "I have footage. She refused them basic service. Cameras were on. So was everyone else." The screen glow from phones lit the cabin like tiny searchlights. The story had left the confines of the aircraft before anyone's feet touched the ground. Up front, the overhead chime sounded, followed by the calm voice of the captain. "Mr. Moreau, operations requests your presence in the forward briefing lounge upon arrival. Executive team is waiting." Cambria visibly flinched. Augustus unbuckled slowly, stood, and reached to button his blazer with a steady hand. "It seems," he said quietly, "my seat was never just about comfort." Delilah rose beside him, her face composed, her hand brushing his shoulder briefly. The aircraft stopped at the gate. The door clicked open with a hiss, and the world outside came rushing in. Not just the air, but the waiting consequences. And as Augustus stepped into the aisle, he wasn't walking out of a flight anymore. He was walking into a reckoning. The cabin doors had opened only moments earlier, but the shift in atmosphere had been building long before the wheels touched the ground. Passengers filed out slowly, some offering polite nods, others stealing sideways glances at Augustus and Delilah as they remained seated, waiting for the crowd to clear. A middle-aged woman in a denim jacket gave Augustus a soft smile and murmured, "Thank you." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Delilah walked beside her husband as they exited the plane. She didn't speak, didn't rush. Her hand rested lightly on his arm. She moved like someone used to watching storms form behind polite smiles. Calm but never unseeing. They were escorted without a word to a quiet corner of the terminal, past security doors and polished signs. A side corridor led them to a closed conference room, the Forward Briefing Lounge. The placard on the door was generic, but everyone in aviation knew what it meant. Inside, the air was cooler, and the lighting was intentionally neutral. The room was small, furnished with practical chairs and a long oval table. At one end stood the interim CEO of Skynova, flanked by the head of public relations and two attorneys from the company's legal team. And standing alone at the far end of the room, arms crossed and posture stiff, was Cambria Sloan. The door shut quietly behind Augustus as he stepped in. Every eye in the room turned toward him. Cambria, eyes sharp, broke the silence first. "I want to clarify," she said, her voice a mix of indignation and defense. "I didn't know who he was. I was under stress. And frankly, the way they looked, it was unusual for this cabin." The pause that followed was not the kind that waited for permission. It was the kind that spoke volumes. One of the company lawyers leaned forward, hands clasped. "Cambria," he said evenly, "the issue isn't who he was. It's who you assumed he wasn't." Cambria's mouth opened again, but no words came. The room gave her nothing to cling to. No nods, no averted eyes, just silence. Augustus hadn't moved from where he stood near the door. He hadn't sat down, hadn't reached for the water bottle at the table. He just stood, quiet and tall, as though the room itself was waiting on him to level it. "This isn't about me," he said finally, his voice low but unwavering. "It's about every silent man, every overlooked woman, whoever sat in the right seat and was told they didn't belong." He turned his gaze to the interim CEO. "We don't get to act surprised, not anymore. And I will not let this company carry forward that legacy." No one interrupted him. No one needed to. "I'm making this clear," he continued. "Effective immediately, Cambria Sloan is permanently removed from all flights in any capacity representing this airline." Cambria's lips pressed into a tight line, but she didn't speak. Even she knew this wasn't a debate anymore. Augustus took a step forward, still standing. "We will initiate a full cultural audit and service retraining, with a focus on first class. That cabin sets the tone. From this day forward, it will reflect the values we claim to hold." There was a pause, a single, still moment, before a voice broke the calm. A man in a tailored blazer, likely someone from corporate strategy, shifted in his chair and said quietly, "This could turn into a PR disaster. Are you sure you want to fire someone this publicly?" Augustus didn't hesitate. "It's already public. The only question now is whether we choose to lead or to hide." That landed like stone in water. The room held its breath, and no one offered a counter. After another long moment, the interim CEO gave a slow nod. "Understood," she said. Augustus turned toward the door. He didn't offer thanks or wait for agreement. He had made the call, and that was the end of it. Outside, Delilah stood near the wall, her hands gently clasped in front of her. When he stepped out, she looked up but didn't ask anything. She didn't have to. "It's done," he said softly. She nodded once. No celebration, no pride. Just a knowing, steady peace between them. Together, they walked down the corridor, side by side. Ahead, just past the security glass, a cluster of reporters had begun to gather. Voices rising, flashes of cameras already visible. But Augustus didn't look toward them. His eyes stayed forward. He wasn't walking into a spotlight. He was walking away from shadows. By the time Augustus and Delilah exited the internal corridor, the story had already become something far bigger than the flight. News vans lined the outer curb of the terminal, and journalists clustered like birds sensing a shift in the wind. The buzz of microphones, flashing cameras, and hushed, eager conversations filled the air. The quiet storm that began at 35,000 feet had found its thunder on the ground. Screens inside the terminal played clips from earlier that morning, already edited into breaking news packages. One headline read, "Airline co-owner faces racial bias mid-flight." Another read simply, "That hashtag had exploded online." Retweeted, reposted, echoed through thousands of voices that had seen enough for one lifetime. Before they reached the exit, Cambria was waiting. She stood alone near the edge of the hallway, no longer in uniform, her hair let down, eyes rimmed with fatigue. Her arms were wrapped around her middle. Not in defiance this time, but as if to hold something broken inside. When Augustus saw her, he slowed, and Delilah stepped to the side, giving him space. Cambria took a hesitant step forward. "Mr. Moreau, Augustus," her voice cracked. "I made a mistake. I didn't mean to." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. "You meant exactly what you said," he replied, calm but heavy. "That's what made it real." She looked down, swallowing hard. The polished pride she had worn so tightly all day was gone. In its place stood someone stripped bare, not by anger but by truth. "Do you really think," she whispered, barely audible, "firing me changes anything?" Augustus looked at her, quiet again for a moment, then met her eyes fully. "No," he said, "but maybe someone watching, someone listening, will decide not to be you." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked away, and this time she didn't follow. The automatic doors parted with a soft hiss, and the outside world rushed in. Sunlight, shouts, cameras. Augustus and Delilah stepped into the glow, hand in hand. The noise swelled around them, a mix of flashes and voices calling out questions all at once. One reporter, her voice rising above the rest, asked clearly, "Mr. Moreau, do you want to make a statement?" Augustus paused. He turned slowly, scanning the crowd. Reporters from CNN, NBC, a dozen independent creators holding up phones. The world was watching, waiting. He took a breath and said, "I didn't come here to be seen. I came to fly home with my wife." There was a pause, then he continued, his voice firm and plain. "But now that you're watching, let me be clear. Dignity is not an upgrade. It's included in every seat, for everyone." There was a flicker, a silence between people, as if his words had dropped into the collective chest of the crowd. Then the clicking of cameras picked up again. Phones went up higher. News feeds lit up in real time as the quotes spread like wildfire. Screens in the terminal began flashing his image alongside the caption. Delilah squeezed his hand, and they kept walking. As they moved through the crowd, people began to part, not out of fear but out of respect. Some clapped quietly. One man whispered, "Thank you," just loud enough for them to hear. When they reached the quieter stretch past the chaos, Delilah looked up at him. "You didn't just land a plane today," she said softly. Augustus smiled. "A real one, the first in a long time." "No," he said. "I think we just took off." They kept walking, side by side, toward the long corridor leading out. The terminal lights stretched ahead like a runway. And as they moved further away from the noise, it wasn't silence that followed them. It was something else. Momentum. 1 week later, the world had moved on in the way it always does, fast and without waiting. Headlines gave way to new stories, trending tags lost momentum, and airport terminals filled again with quiet routines and idle chatter. But not everything had faded. Sky Nova issued a formal statement on a Thursday morning. No press conference, no fanfare, just a clear, concise message released across all platforms. Effective immediately, Cambria Sloan has been terminated due to violations of professional conduct and discriminatory behavior that do not reflect the values of Sky Nova Airlines. There was no denial, no attempt to spin, and for many that said more than a dozen apologies ever could. Cambria herself surfaced briefly, days later, appearing on a small podcast hosted by a former airline employee turned social commentator. She didn't dress the part of a victim or a villain. She wore a plain blouse, hair pulled back, voice quieter than usual. "I was raised to think certain people didn't belong in certain places," she said. "But maybe I was wrong." She didn't defend her actions. She didn't fully apologize either. But she admitted something that perhaps mattered more. She admitted belief could be flawed, and that belief had consequences. After that, she disappeared from the industry. No longer a figure of authority, just another person trying to make sense of who she had been. Meanwhile, Sky Nova launched a sweeping campaign called Sky for All. Augustus never appeared at the podium, never sat for an interview, but he was in every line of policy, every phrase in the new training manuals, every meeting where decisions were being reshaped from the inside out. The airline rolled out a complete overhaul of staff training with renewed focus on empathy, cultural sensitivity, and real-world accountability. A diverse passenger feedback council was formed to advise on everything from menu choices to boarding protocols. And perhaps most notably, a new phrase appeared at the bottom of every ticket, at the top of every gate monitor. Respect isn't a privilege, it's protocol. In Savannah, the weather had turned softer, and the days felt longer. Augustus and Delilah sat together in the living room of their modest home, the afternoon light spilling across the carpet like a second presence in the room. Delilah sipped her tea, then looked over the rim of the cup. "Do you think she'll ever understand what she did?" she asked gently. Augustus sat back, eyes fixed on the soft sway of the magnolia tree outside the window. "Maybe, maybe not," he said. "But this wasn't about her understanding. It was about us being seen." Delilah leaned her head on his shoulder, her voice barely above a breath. "Then let's keep helping people be seen." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. The quiet between them was answer enough. They had walked through a storm and come out steady, not untouched, but standing. A few days later, a letter arrived in the mail, handwritten, folded carefully, no return address. It was from the young woman who had changed seats during the flight, who had spoken when no one else had. "You didn't just defend yourselves," it read. "You reminded me I had a voice. Thank you." Augustus read it twice, then placed it gently on the corner of his desk. He didn't frame it or put it on display. He just left it there, visible to him and no one else. A quiet reminder that sometimes the ripple was the point. In the final days of that month, Sky Nova recorded a new welcome video for incoming employees. Augustus agreed to appear. One time, one message. He sat alone on a stool in front of a plain background, hands folded loosely in his lap. "The skies don't belong to money," he said, looking straight into the camera, "or status, or skin color. They belong to the people, all people. And while we can't change the past, we sure as hell can fly better into the future." The video ended with the new slogan displayed in white on black. Every seat, every flight, every soul. Respected. Weeks passed. Headlines changed again. But some things stuck. On an ordinary morning not long after, Augustus and Delilah boarded a new flight. This time, no fanfare, no lounge access, no priority line. They chose the back row, economy class, middle of the cabin, the humblest of seats. As they settled in, a young white flight attendant paused by their row, smiling warmly. "Welcome aboard," she said. "We're honored to have you." Delilah turned to Augustus and smiled, soft and full of something only time could give. "Maybe we do belong everywhere after all," she said. Augustus didn't say anything at first. He just looked out the window, where the morning sun was already rising across the tarmac. Then he nodded once, slow and sure. The plane began to move, wheels rolling toward the runway, the sky ahead clear and wide. Sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that don't shout, but choose the right moment to speak. This story wasn't just about one flight or one man. It was about the quiet choices that shape how we treat one another, whether we're in the air or on the ground. What would you have done in his seat? Let us know your thoughts. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge, inspire, and stay with you long after they're told.